Now, there was a huge sum of money allocated that would make it possible to give grants up to $50 million or so per development, more than had ever been allocated for this purpose. And our job was to write the regulations. And I must say, sometimes it's better to be lucky than smart, because I had the good fortune to be surrounded by a team of people who came from the Hill, who came from public housing. Our public housing director, for example, the person that we selected to be the assistant secretary for public housing, a man named Joe Schuldiner, had been the public housing director in New York City and in Los Angeles, the two largest cities in the country. So what a base of experience to bring. And we had the benefit of tapping the brains of some of the more creative people in the public housing field. And so as we sat to write the regulations, a team led by my chief of staff, a man named Bruce Katz, who now heads the Metropolitan Center at the Brookings Institution. Brilliant, came from the Hill, had been part of this frustration of watching public housing go sideways for all these years. A number of themes began to emerge. One of the themes was to try to create a setting in which the government money wouldn't be the whole ball game, but that other approaches to bringing private capital so that mixed financing could occur. In other words, drawing the best energies of America's private sector real estate community and investors by using the substantial federal money as the base to do things that were public, but to create openings for private investment. And that required some reinterpretations of existing law by our general counsel at HUD, key rulings that said this would be possible, that you could spend private resources in ground that had been acquired as public housing sites and so forth. We were very careful to make sure that we always intended this to be primarily housing for persons who were public housing eligible, but add for sale or add market rentals or add commercial and mixed use into what were clearly the new wave of kind of urban projects. Another thing we were lucky to do was to bring together a group of path-breaking young architects who call themselves the New Urbanists. And this was a movement that was just beginning in that period. They just had their charter convention in Charleston, which I attended, and now some of their names are well known in the architectural field. People like Andres Duani and Peter Calthorpe, really brilliant people who were sort of basically saying, in architecture, we're prepared to say the emperor wears no clothes, and say that these big boxes, these post-World War II modernist structures are not fit for human habitation. They haven't worked. And what we need to do is to get to a lower scale and find concepts that work for human beings, like private space, defensible space, that people can have their own space, and things like walkability to other amenities. And this was a big one, breaking up the super blocks that were the concept of public housing after World War II and reintegrating the streetscape, the vitality, the Jane Jacobs notion of a vigorous kind of urban neighborhood streetscape that exists in the surrounding neighborhoods, and bringing it into public housing. So you could have eyes on the street. So you could have a smaller scale, etc. I'll say more about that in a second. So a lot of ideas began to come forward that found their way into the regulations. Meantime, I was out about the country trying to learn. I had been the mayor of San Antonio, but housing, I'm the first to admit, was not my forte. I spent a lot of time on job creation and economic development, and that's where Andy and I worked together. But to be named Secretary of Housing and suddenly in charge of homelessness and public housing and FHA subsidized rentals, that was really not my strength. So I had to learn. My first trip on that learning expedition was here to Atlanta, and I ended up one afternoon in Techwood Clark Howell Homes, and spent an evening with the residents, walking through projects and sitting down talking to people. And I did that in a lot of places. One of those trips was to Baltimore. I had Jim Rouse, the wonderful urbanist, had invited me to come to see a project he was doing there called Sandtown Winchester. And the Mayor Kurt Schmoke, came over to visit. I had the previous day, this was on a Monday, on the previous Sunday I'd read a piece in the Washington Post about a public housing tower that was in meltdown in Baltimore, a high-rise building with not just the standard problem of rodents and not working elevators and lights that don't go on and air conditioning that doesn't work, but in this case, drug lords running the buildings and real problems. So as we were standing in this site, I saw the building literally within a few blocks away, and I said to the mayor, "Do you mind if we go over and take a look?" And the mayor said, "No, let's walk over there." So here comes an entourage of the mayor and the HUD secretary and Jim Rouse going to see this place. And the police at the base of the building said, "Sorry, Mr. Mayor, we just can't let you go in there." So, "What do you mean can't go in there?" We haven't swept the building, and we cannot take responsibility for your walking around a staircase into a drug transaction and the shooting starts, and we're just not going to let you do it. So here was the mayor of the city and the Secretary of Housing for the United States that could not go into a building which we expected mothers with children to go into on their own in that place. And it was just the beginning of the realizations, the beginnings of the things that I saw across the country. In Kansas City, I walked into a public housing building, and because there was just a little bit of pre-warning that we're coming into the building, men were rushing the other way as we were going up the stairs with jackets that were still bulging with cash dropping out of the jackets from the drug transactions that they were sort of hosting, if you will, in the corridors of the building. In Chicago, mothers told me stories about they and their daughters being frisked by gang members who ran the buildings, literally ran the buildings on orders from drug lords in prison. I mean, the anecdotal stories of gang members who, as soon as the lights were put in the hallways by the maintenance officials, the gang members went and took them out because they didn't want to create silhouettes as they stood in at the ends of the hallways overseeing the neighborhood or being a target for the police. Police were shot at from the upper stories of these buildings with people with high-powered rifles. The school in the nearby neighborhood ceased allowing its athletic teams to practice outside because there were random shooters from the buildings up high. A little boy was thrown off of the top of one of the buildings because at something like 8 years old, he had not followed instructions from the drug lords that were running the building, and they threw him off the top of the building. It was a Saturday, and I went to Chicago immediately when that happened, and diverted from another place that I was visiting. I spent the night in places like Robert Taylor Homes in Chicago and Richard Allen Homes in Philadelphia, where the story was hundreds of millions of dollars was diverted from public housing improvements to the mafia lords that decided who would get the window contracts and who would fix the doors and who would do the cleaning contracts, etc. I mean, it was an utter disaster. And the worst of it was that human beings, people, mostly mothers and children, because in some buildings the system worked so poorly, the rules had been written over the years that there was not one single intact family in the building, not one person working at a regular job in any unit in an entire building. And frequently there were buildings where about a third of the units had been burned out, and people were living next to an empty building that had been destroyed and with rodents next door to them and coming into their place. I can't tell you how bad Atlanta, whatever conditions were here, which I saw with my own eyes at University Homes and others, they were not nearly as bad as what we found in Newark and Chicago and Philadelphia and Baltimore and these places.